All right, guys. Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Theory and Theology. On this podcast, we talk about spirituality and cultures and theories and religion and all sorts of good stuff like that. So I wanted to talk about Inuit tribes in the Arctic. So I am by no means an expert, but a lot of different tribal cultures just fascinate me, especially because, like, at least half of my family came from a tribal culture that, my great-grandparents' life looked different from my grandparents' life, looked different from my parents slash aunts and uncles, that generation's life, and now my life looks so far removed from what my great grandparents' lives looked like. Like, I used to think about this, I would think about, I still do think about it. On my mom's side, my great grandmother passed away while I was, let me see. It was, these calculations are so hard. It was between, like, either, I want to say about 7 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, when she was 105 years old. And I thought about it, and I was like, wow, she was born just after the turn of the century. So whenever I would watch movies, I've watched a lot of movies about, how a lot of different tribal groups around the world, particularly the North American ones that I focused on maybe more, they got taken over by, Western culture and slaughtered and, unfortunately, a lot of those tribal groups, and a lot of them definitely thrive and a lot of them are surviving, but, I don't want to discount the fact that, that's their history, but, just like it's not the same thing, but saying, like, American black slavery or Caribbean black slavery or different black groups of slaves, you know, I know, at least when, I'm in classes or something and people bring up black people and always just say black people and slavery, it's kind of like, okay, that's not the whole story. You don't always have to bring up the slavery. Like, let's bring up the stuff that actually does work too. Like, it's not all about slavery. When you look at black people, you see, a lot of people around the world see black people in the media, but there might be, like, the stories about crimes and things like that, but there's also, the athletes, the musicians, the very creative, very talented people, who kind of are self-made, a lot of the time too. I'm not saying that that's the whole of the culture, but it's like, if you look on the very surface levels, those are kind of the stories you hear in black culture. And I know in indigenous cultures, there are stories that are kind of just on the surface told too, which would be like the genocides and, all these other types of things, but you hardly hear the stories of how people are kind of thriving later on. Like, it is super complex, just like with black people, it's super complex. Like, a lot of groups by no means are, like, better off because of their history of how things went down. And there's definitely a lot of disparity, a lot of tragedy, trauma, so it's kind of hard to know how much to focus on which aspects, because I'm not trying to be insensitive. I'm not trying to just, like, pigeonhole everybody into these groups of, like, okay, this is the tragic part of the history that's a reality too, and not make light of it and not never mention it. but then also not like just only talk about like this is their story, all of their story, lump everybody into one group and be like, this is all we're gonna talk about is the tragedies. But something that definitely interests me about the Arctic groups, and Canadian, Alaskan, the ones that are called like basically either indigenous or First Nations or whatever, but I think the Inuit tribes tend to be, at least in my opinion, the ones that come up the most as far as like the content that I see online. It tends to be mostly Inuit groups. But I'm also not sure if it's because that's what I'm searching. But yeah, I've also mentioned before about Isuma.tv, and I've also mentioned about some of the movies that I like. I'm really fascinated by the culture, especially because it's something I never really knew about. And like, even in school, like you're taught about maybe like Eskimos, but you're not really taught much about them. Like you're just taught like they exist and it's cold and you're not taught much about them. So, or any other group for that matter, but you're kind of taught like basic stuff. You're not taught like any real life, like what's their life like now. So when I started watching a lot of movies and documentaries and stuff about Inuit tribes, one thing I noticed is that I have a really hard time telling the difference between how old the setting is for whatever is the movie, whatever. Like, for example, what I mean by that is I could watch a movie that seems like it was, from 1980, like placed in the 1980s. I can watch a movie that's placed in like 1900 or 1850 or something, and a lot of times it looks the same. Like the setting looks so similar. I've only noticed the ones that seem to be like from the 90s or so. You start seeing people with like snowmobiles. Now, I don't really know the real timelines, but I do notice, a lot of the more modern movies are in, uh, you know, people more so in like towns and stuff, but not like thriving. It seems like before, other than like, the dangers of, being out in the wilderness and it seemed like people had their communities. The stories you see are like people with their communities. There's some supernatural stuff that goes on sometimes, and there's some other types of stuff that goes on with like maybe like the weather or like urgent types of situations. But outside of that, it's not necessarily like stories of like government oppression and stuff like that. Um, um, but yeah, that's something that has been interesting me, catching my attention, because I do follow a lot of, or have been starting to be interested in following a lot of indigenous North American groups, like getting a little more familiar with like different tribes that I've never heard about, and kind of like their stories, their lineages. I started doing this project based on where I live, and just kind of like anything that kind of comes up near areas in LA or in San Diego where I've lived, like who were the original people that were there, and kind of how did the cities kind of develop to look how they look currently. There's something about knowing that history that's like, wow, I've never, ever, ever touched this history, but it's available now. At least there are versions of it that are available now, with all the social media and everything and YouTube. Like, it's easy to find people telling stories and go onto websites and find websites about these tribes of people and see kind of like, is it a reservation? Do they have like, what does their society look like? And, I feel like I never really had like much of an open door to like indigenous American culture, like other than what I've mentioned before, when I would see like street names or city names or just like names of stuff where you're just like, how come everything's like, it would always just be completely confusing to me that like everything in LA is in Spanish. Same with San Diego. A lot of stuff is in Spanish. And then there's other stuff in languages that you're like, this is not Spanish. It's not like a Vietnamese language. It's not a Chinese language. It's not, it's not Japanese. It's not, it's not a familiar like Asian language. It's not a familiar language that I know. And you're just like seeing these words all over the place. All over your city, like everywhere. And I pay attention to that kind of stuff because I'm like, sometimes you see things that are just like, they just, not really that they're out of place, but it's like, I kind of wonder, like I think one of the first things that caught my interest was in San Diego. At one point, I lived near Tecolote Canyon, and then I remember going up to Quay Peak, and there's this little area in, one or two little areas that I know about in what's it called? Mission Trails, where you can see some of the the history that's written of like the indigenous people who lived in that area. And when I went up to that peak, I kind of felt like, okay, like I want to know what's this name, like, and then what's the name of this canyon and all this kind of stuff. And I started finding out, oh, like these are like the original names of like indigenous, people groups, and I started seeing like Sequan all over the place. And I remember once I used to listen to like independent radio of some form. I can't remember what I was listening to exactly. Maybe it was an archived episode of something, but they were, or maybe it was on the radio, and they were talking about like, in San Diego, the Sequan, the people, of Sequan. And it was like when I first moved there, and I was like, oh, like there's like indigenous groups out here? Like I didn't even know. And so yeah, and they're like, it's like within a drivable distance. It's like right there, So I was pretty curious. I was like, okay, like so there's a presence, and like, it's just like under, the mainstream of what society kind of talks about. So I went from there, and I started just, just briefly being interested in certain things. And like I mentioned, I watched the powwows online because they used to just be a website, powwows.com, and now they have like a YouTube channel where they, show online like on a pretty regular basis, live feed of the powwows every weekend. So I started watching the ones, or at least some of the ones, but I started watching the ones that were like closest to areas in like LA and San Diego, because I'm like, that's pretty close to home, at least it's in the same state. And like, trying to learn about these different groups just by like, okay, this is their, they're hosting a powwow. And like, I know powwows are like a more kind of modern thing, but like I'm learning, like, and there's names of tribes that I've never heard of. I knew there were names that I'd never heard of before, but it's like I kind of think, okay, like these people live like this many miles away. It would be like that amount of a drive, and like, how are they different from the people that were on here last week or whatever? It's kind of like, looking on their websites, most of them so far, at least that I've come across, every tribal name like has like websites, at least one official website dedicated to their tribe, if not more, information. And so I look at least the basic tribe website and see kind of like modern day, like what's going on. And it's just a kind of different connection with the cities that I love that I've never really had before, because usually I'm focused on, the party, like what I'm doing, but I do like history a lot. Not like it as in like I think it's fun. Like for a lot of us, history was not fun, but I mean, I just like learning about history from a perspective of what interests me. And, I've always been fascinated by different types of cultures. Like, you guys know how I've been fascinated by religious cultures, but different tribal groups has also been a fascination of mine. Ever since I was young, like, one thing I do try to do is at least look at what every culture that I learn about kind of has as like positive, like, aspects and strengths of their culture, of things that I maybe wasn't raised with or I wasn't raised around. And I kind of use those like cultural like values or cultural like kind of actions and things that different cultures do to see if it's something that I can kind of resonate with, that I would maybe add to my life as like something that could benefit me, or I might even like experiment with it and try it. And like that's kind of like how I got interested in learning about psychedelics. That's kind of how I got interested in learning about meditation, how I got interested in learning about different sleep wake related things and different like mindsets of thinking, mindsets about work, mindsets about family, mindsets about traditions, that, I may not have grown up with that kind of thinking. And it just really challenges my mind to just like, take in different ideas from other cultures and see kind of how they do something. So as far as the Inuit tribes, what I was watching today was something I'd saved ages ago, but there's a YouTube channel called Life That Matters, and it has a reaching remote or reaching out to series, and this specific episode was called Reaching Remote Inuit Tribes in the Arctic documentary. And so there's a lot of little documentaries on this YouTube channel, and that's one of them. It's about 49 minutes long, and this isn't the first time I'm hearing a story sort of similar, but it's probably the freshest one that I've just recently viewed. And so something that I learned that I didn't know is that with some of the Inuit tribes' history, a lot of their changes to their traditional way of life started just recently in the 1950s. Now, something that is interesting to me is really just the history of, tribal groups. Because one thing I was noticing when I was studying more about like Zimbabwe and South Africa and those different tribal groups, from where my family is from, I started learning about, what time frame, different people were coming, like, Rhodes, because Zimbabwe was previously Rhodesia, so you know, they named it after after Rhodes, named it Rhodesia. It's Zimbabwe now. And South Africa having apartheid, and the Afrikaners, the Dutch groups that came in. You know, a lot of this was happening like in the late 1800s. So I think about it and I'm like, yeah, that was like just a bit before my great grandma was born. That wasn't that long ago when you think about it. And so when I think about things like that, I'm like, oh, she would have been like hearing the history of like what, or maybe if she was in what was going on in current events or whatever, but that might have been like recent history for somebody to know about, or something recently happening, politically, for some people, So I did find that to be very, very interesting. And so, just the time frames and stuff, I was like, wow, that's pretty recent when I think of stuff that happened like in my great grandmother's day when there were tribes that were, still living their traditional lives untouched, unbothered for the most part. Um, and then, now, I was learning more about that this was just, not that long ago, 1950s, that's like about 70 years ago. And they said the area that they were talking about in this documentary, they said, at a certain time period, like way back, there were like 70 people in the village, and now there's like 7,000. And they said, some of them were talking about how when they were younger, in their lifetime, they remember having, living off the land, their hunter gatherer with, dog sleds, and, so if you think about that, it's like just looking at different generations, the generation before the current one, the people who would be like about my parents' age, them and their parents would have been living off the land pretty much compared to now with people with the snowmobiles and, the tragic history where they're saying that like, the people who were taking over were like, they killed all their dogs. Now I've heard in other, not in this documentary, but I've heard in other cultural documentaries. I don't know if it was the Inuit tribes specifically, but some tribes that were like in Alaska or somewhere like that, where they talked about, being able to save some of the dogs, but there was something about the places where they were living in those like towns or villages, like in those towns, like in houses instead of like being out on the land, following herds, going from camp to camp, hunting, gathering, eating, like I found it very interesting that they were um, um, yeah, I forgot what I was saying, sorry. But I found that it was pretty interesting that um, those people who had their dogs kind of slaughtered, like they weren't able to grow a next generation of those dogs. They said like the next generation, the dogs would always get ill, they would always get sick. Um, and I don't remember if they had a reason why, like if they found out why or not, but the dogs would always get sick. So even when they tried to like make new uh their own new, what do you call it, like kind of rebuild what had been like taken, um they weren't able because like a big part of the culture was the dogs. Like you had to have the dogs to be able to go um with the sled from place to place, um and you had to be able to be mobile because of how the herds would move. Like you can't just travel on foot. Like you have to have some method of getting places. And the thing is about the dogs is that they're not going to freeze to death, first of all. Second of all, like that's basically the animal that was used, like and that's how they had their training and how to how the dogs would, like some would lead, and then you'd have like a pack. And it seems like, at least to my understanding, it seems like whenever I've seen them in like episodes of things, like it seems like the dogs are always kind of like tied up, but they're always like together. um and they're fed, they're pretty hyper, um but they weren't able to like rebuild or populate the dogs that were lost. And so you can't really do a lot of the hunting and stuff by foot like that all the time like that, with no mode of transportation. You can't get as far. And to use snowmobiles, I mean, first of all, you have to be able to afford it. You have to be able to afford maintenance, and you have to be able to afford fuel. Like, I mean, animals, yeah, you have to feed them and maintain them too, but it is kind of like a different form of economy because you're not owning those. You know, you're not owning, well, I guess, yeah, you can own like a snowmobile or whatever, but it's like, you still have to purchase it. You still have to get it. You're not like raising them till they're old enough and training them and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a different process. So basically, people, even in the 1950s, were being put, kids being put in residential schools. They did touch on, the trauma that people experience and how they got, a lot of different types of abuse, unfortunately, and they weren't able to really handle their not that they weren't. I don't want us to sound like I'm blaming them. I mean, a lot of times people aren't taught, or there aren't resources for them to get the help they need. I'll put it that way. It's not that they weren't able to handle it. I don't want it to sound like, oh, they couldn't handle the abuse, so they went and were abusive to other people. Like, what I'm trying to say is that there was a cycle to the abuse, but that's a more recent cycle because of it not being that long ago. And if you think about other, cultures too, that were tribal in their traditions, like a lot of them experiencing these kinds of changes, they mention this, that, there's not really like a positive benefit to it necessarily. And so, that's kind of what I gathered from this. I mean, I'm in no way trying to like make groups of people sound like they're not able to sustain themselves. They are, which is kind of one of the problems that I see here, is that if groups are able to sustain themselves, like, leave them alone. Like, if they're not asking for help, why do people come, and destroy their way of life and be like, you have to live in these buildings now and you can't hunt for yourself and you have to work and make money so you can pay for food. And a lot of these shows and stuff about Alaska, it shows how in some places, some towns, the food is so expensive that it's like, it can be like 15, $20 for like a bag of chips or something. It's like, that's why people live off the land. It's like, you can't really afford to eat if you don't have money. You have to like find a way to do something. And so, that's a problem. It's like, if you take someone's way of life away and be like, live like this now instead, but then you don't give them opportunity, or if they don't want to do it, like, they weren't asking, oh, help us because we're not able to sustain ourselves. From what it seems like, they were sustaining themselves just fine until somebody imposed a different way of life on them by force and, tried to wipe out their culture for whatever reasons, either because, religious reasons, for feeling like, they were in some way a heathen or like a negative person. So that is one reason why. And then, I mean, there are multiple reasons, but, definitely corporate greed, definitely, people wanting to have like trade relationships or like control, you can't control people if they can, decide for themselves how much they can sustain themselves, where they live, where they go, what they have to pay, what they don't have to pay. I mean, if you think of it, living off the land, you're not paying for the land. You don't have to pay for it. If you're living in igloos, you know how to make housing wherever you need to be. If it's a time of year where you only can have igloos, or if you have tents and things, you're able to make it for yourself and camp, by the water or wherever you need to camp at. You can hunt, all kind of like caribou, reindeer, seals. Seems like seals are a big one. Whales, polar bears. Make all your clothes from that. Make all the products you need to use throughout the day, and throughout your life for that. You're basically self sufficient. It's like, you know, you don't need somebody coming in and telling you what to do, but people come in and then they do that, and then now, these people are stuck with, people contaminating their land. I've mentioned before, and like other stories of people, how they say, even trying to go out and hunt for yourself, you're getting some kind of like, some people are getting some kind of poisoning from the metals, giving them like certain types of nerve problems. I mean, what are people supposed to do? Like, it's just, I don't know, it irritates me to no end. I'm just like, you know, um, I mean, these greedy people who go in and try to take all this different stuff, and it's like, you're not helping these people. They don't need your help, like, leave them the fuck alone, and just let them live their lives, and stop trying to, like, turn everybody into one type of group of people. Like, not everybody needs to live a Western lifestyle. Um, Other cultures are very beautiful as they are, like, um, of course, every culture has humans, and we all have the same types of human faults overall. Like, there's going to be the greedy people, the people who lie, the people who steal, the abusive people, the ones who, cheat, and the ones who kill. And, there's going to be those types of people in every group of people that exist on Earth. If you have a culture and group of people together, there's going to be people that have negative qualities. There's no group that's like everybody's all good, but it's like, adding more problems to their lives doesn't help them. It doesn't help them, and especially when they're doing well, or better, or at least had a way to problem solve. I don't know if I'd be able to live in those types of towns where it's like, how much are you making if your chips are costing you like $15? Like, how much are you actually making? Where are you actually working? Is the work satisfying? How does it impact your family life? Yeah. And then you know, I mean, I don't know how much people are affected by the cold there, or how much people are affected by, certain times of year where there's like multiple days of darkness. I think not good, but also, people acclimate to the cold and stuff like that, but it is harsh. It's a harsh environment weather-wise. And like, it's not always like snowing, depending where it is. Like, it's not always snowing. It's not always icy and stuff like that. Like, they have like other types of weather, you know, depending. But yeah, it's still like they have a different way of traditional culture, based on where they live. And so, and like kind of how it is there. So I don't really think that, I don't know, like, I'm glad to kind of learn about different cultures, but it's like, I wasn't aware how recent, a lot of these populations were affected. So it's something I'm still studying. Like, a lot of different indigenous groups, I'm still kind of studying them. But as snowboard season approaches, I start thinking more and more about like winters and snow in Alaska and stuff like that, and the Arctic. I don't know, it's just like on my mind. But that's the only thing that I have, you know, in, uh, you know, in, um, when it comes to, you know, culture surrounding like anything that has to do with like snow or anything like that. I mean, living in like LA and San Diego, we don't think about snow like that. Like, it's not like a big part of the culture. I mean, up in the mountains, LA has mountains. They're far away, but you know, Wrightwood has mountains, and it's Wrightwood's in the mountains. It's technically LA. You know, there's a city limit, an LA city limit sign up there. So part of Wrightwood is in Los Angeles County, even though it's freaking far. But yeah, that is the mountains, and it does snow there, and I do go snowboarding up there. But yeah, I I'm getting more and more curious. Um, just trying to post about what I learn. Um, I'm gonna post the link below of the episode that I watched. You can watch the whole thing start to finish if you want. I'll have the link there. And thanks for listening.